I am now excited to welcome in Amy Webb.
Hey there.
Hi, Amy.
How
Thanks
are
so
you?
much for joining us. I'm doing really well.
Thank you
Um,
for having me.
Indeed, and thank you for joining us. Let me give you a quick introduction. Amy is the founder of the Future Today Institute and professor of strategic foresight at the New York University Stern School of Business. And in this session, we are going to take on the 11 sources of disruption every company should monitor. And I do want to go through them kind of quickly one by one, but I do have an opening rather pressing question. Was the coronavirus one of them?
um, yes and no, right? So what I would say is that um, would I have known that a coronavirus at this particular moment in time would have caused this amount of disruption? No. I mean, there's no way to build that kind of a model using any available data. However, are pandemics something that everybody should always be thinking about? I mean, yes, right? And the challenge, of course, is, and the promise of strategic foresight, you can't predict exactly when things over which you have very little control will happen, but you can create a state of readiness. And that's, in fact, the entire point and professional role of a futurist is to create a state of readiness. And this 11 macro sources of disruption is one way to get started.
Well, great. So let's work our way through them, and we don't have to do kind of a lightning round version of this. We can spend a
You don't want to spend the next half hour of me just reading through all of them.
No, it's quite the list, and I kind of think about it. I mean, we call it in the article, we call it 11. We might be better characterized as 10 plus 1, but we'll get to that in a second. But let's work our way through, beginning with wealth distribution.
Sure. So again, I think that let me maybe back up really quickly. So this sort of, my colleague Mark Palatucci likes to call it the wheel of disruption. So picture, if you will, a circle, if you haven't seen this thing yet, a series of concentric circles. And in the middle of it is your organization, then goes technology, and then go these other sources of change. And this all stems back to the Future Today Institute's future forces theory, which really explains that disruption tends to stem from influential factors that combine together over which you have no singular control. And a lot of times when organizations are trying to chart a path to the future, they tend to look only within their own industry. And the challenge, of course, is that everything is so interconnected that what happens, in technology in some ways might have some influence over technology, and in some weird way may portend huge changes on the horizon for the cold chain, right? So the trick is to use a framework to try to sort all of this out. So back to wealth distribution. So, this goes beyond your sort of traditional economic indicators. What we're looking at is how does the emergence of some kind of macro force or technology or whatever it might be, some change. If we look at that through the lens of wealth distribution, where does that get to? So are we looking at narrower or wider gaps between haves and have-nots? Are we looking at what might have been an emerging economy that suddenly is experiencing tremendous growth in a way that it maybe hadn't before? And that doesn't just tell us where the money is going. It also tells us something about the future of potential social unrest, markets that are ready to be made, areas that are ripe for innovation, et cetera.
Thank you. And since we started with one of the items on the list that might not feel as immediately relevant to every organization or every company, I do want to kind of put an exclamation point or a punctuation point on something you said earlier. All 11 of these sources are relevant to everybody, right? It's just a question of being able to connect the dots between this trend and its potential impact on your business.
That's right. And so again, companies tend to focus on threats that are familiar, opportunities that feel immediate and familiar, because they've already got the systems in place to monitor and to measure all of those risks or to deal with opportunities. But this tends to create a brittle situation where organizations aren't prepared for things that they didn't feel like they could see coming. And that leads to leaders having to make quick decisions under duress. So the trick here is, yes, you got to measure what you can measure and focus on what you normally focus on, but you have to do that while looking at the interconnectedness of a bunch of different things. I realize we have several thousand people on this call, but Paul, can I show you a visual real quick?
Absolutely.
So I'm in my home office. Everybody who's watching, don't judge. I'm going to spin around and show you one of the outputs of the 10 sources of change. So that's George Michael hanging on my wall. All right, so what you should be seeing on your screen, for those of you watching, looks like maybe like an NCIS crime map. But in practice, what this is me trying to articulate and figure out how the future of artificial intelligence intersects with how we live our everyday life. And so what you can see is some of those sources of change. So I've got geopolitics as a central node, and I've got some other sort of key things, but I'm also looking at biotechnology and censorship and off-planet exploration. And it's the relationships. Again, I'm sort of forcing myself to look at the future through many different lenses, through all these different areas of change. And the output of that gives me this sort of huge map of information, this constellation that helps me frame my understanding of what the future is looking like. I'm going to spin this back around.
Thank you.
Sure. More information than anybody needed?
No, actually great, really cool. Love these bonus visual aids. Let's get back to the list and work our way through. And the second one is certainly germane to our conversation this morning. And I'd love to kind of dig in just a few minutes, and that's education. And I wonder if you can talk about why this is a source that we need to be monitoring in all times, and then maybe some thoughts on the particular challenges of the moment.
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to stop. So again, if we're looking at this, thinking about the future, and we're trying to hunt down where are their signals, where are their trends, how do we start formulating our understanding of the future? You have to do that rooted in data. So this is not about speculation. So the question would be, what do the data tell us about the probable and plausible future of education and the entire educational ecosystem? I think a lot of people's gut tells them right now that kids will be learning at home, like this will have forever changed how kids learn. And as a futurist, the question that I always come back to is, what would it take for X to be Y? So if it's the case that we've got all these kids all around the world right now learning from home, what would it take for this to continue in the future? So here's where, rather than speculating, it's super useful and helpful to think through these other lenses. So infrastructure is a lens. Do we have the technological infrastructure to support not just, in big cities in the United States, but elsewhere in the US and certainly around the world, distance learning? I think some of the technical hurdles we're currently facing doing this seminar might prove out the fact that we're probably not there yet. From bandwidth to having access to the right technology, and not to mention how people, interact with each other. If we think in terms of government and governing, I can't think of many school systems or universities that had data governance policies thought out in advance of this pandemic. So not only did they not have a state of readiness plan in place, in the event that there was going to be a prolonged distance learning event, there's all kinds of data floating around. There's the data that's obvious, this video transmission, but there's also sort of the invisible ambient data. So I don't mean to freak everybody out, but if you've got children and they're learning, on an online platform, there's a tremendous amount of ambient data that's also capable of being scraped and recorded, mined, refined, learned from, that ranges from what's visually in the scene to all of the hums and creaks and other noises being made within your home. That all falls within data governance, and I can assure you that most places didn't have that figured out. Anyhow, I could go through every single part of these, sources of disruption and talk through the future of education. My point in doing a little bit of this is I think we have to get away from speculating in abstraction about the future of work or the future of education, because in practice, there are a lot of other components that ought to be considered, such as, if distance learning is what happens in the fall for whatever reason, what are the next order effects of that? And one next order effect is that, a whole bunch of kids may decide they don't want to go back to school in a distance learning format, and that they'd rather take a gap year. Another way to think about this, so that's a business case. Another way to think about it is, what impact does this coronavirus have on the workforce 20 years from now? The reason I ask that question, and it's an education question and a technology question, and the reason is because there's all this longitudinal data that tells us that early childhood education is paramount in the longer term success of a person. So if we have a prolonged school outage, as we are basically having right now, I know a month doesn't seem like a lot as an adult, but in early childhood development, that's actually quite a bit of time. How does that play out over a very long period of time? And even a better question is, how does that create a strategic vulnerability in the country where you're living? I can tell you that in the United States, this problem that we have with the virus, which is currently a public health problem, is an education problem that we may not see the true negative effects of for another 15 to 20 years. But if we know that that's a plausible risk factor, that's what we got to start mitigating today, quickly.
So that's a huge issue, right? And of course, all the sources you identify are in their own way huge and complicated issues. But as education as we know it may be fundamentally changing before our eyes, that makes our ability to monitor it, kind of coming back to the organizational mandate to be staying on top of these trends, it's seemingly impossible. So how do you begin to wrap your head around even what to look for with respect to education and where it's moving?
Sure. So I'm a big believer in data and frameworks. So I am a quantitative futurist, and most of what I do is use data from many different sources. I model that data using frameworks. A lot of times we're using qualitative data. We get quantitative when we can, and try to understand next order impacts. In my world, longitudinal trends are more important than what's trendy. So again, I would just urge anybody thinking about the future of X, right? Whether that is how people will work, how people will learn, how people will move around. Another big question is whether or not we will suddenly change our approach to climate change, because we now have all of this data showing the immediate impacts of like not driving as much and not having our factories run as much. So again, all of these changes that feel sort of hyper, real and specific in the present do not necessarily portend what the future will look like. So again, what would it take for X to be Y? And the ways in which we are learning right now, I don't think are sustainable given what we know to be true today. There's not, and so going back to wealth distribution, there's plenty of communities in the United States, elsewhere in the world, that can't get online, and children who don't have access to basic technology. So sustaining this over a long period is going to be rough. The federal government in the United States was not ready. I mean, they obviously weren't ready for the pandemic, but they actually weren't ready to work during a time of pandemic. And to some extent, that's because for the past few years, there's been less of an insistence on creating a state of readiness for remote work. So, what does that mean in the farther future? It probably means that just about every industry will be more adaptable to telework going forward. But it certainly doesn't mean that this, what we're experiencing in the present is the new normal. Can I just pause on the new normal piece for a moment? Because that's probably the biggest question I'm getting asked right now. Everybody wants to know, when will things go back to normal, and when will the new normal set in? So again, and I get asked those questions because I'm a futurist, and everybody wants for me to tell them the future. I'm not an oracle, right? I don't know what the future is going to be. But I'm curious about that question, because every strategy officer in every big company that I talk to is asking it right now. I think we're asking the question about normal because really what the question is: when will things stop changing so quickly? When will we have less uncertainty? And the answer to that question, of course, is I don't know. So what I would say right now is, don't chase the answer. Instead, lean into uncertainty, but do it using methods and frameworks, because right now what we should all be doing is making incremental decisions in response to what we see happening, but with an eye on the farther future.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And in fact, it's one of the things that we at Sloan Management Review as an editorial organization have been talking about, kind of more overtly thinking along multiple time dimensions. What we're going to publish in the next 2 weeks, the next 2 months, the next 6 months, which perhaps we always did, but we never did it quite so formally. And I think that's just a really interesting observation. So we're going to get back to the list, everybody, and I'm also going to post all 11 in the chat so you'll all have it. But you said something interesting a few minutes ago. Well, everything you've said is interesting, Amy, but there's something that kind of stuck with me, and that is, should we have been prepared for the jolt to remote work, or at least been more well prepared than we were?
I think there's going to be obviously a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking if sports ever starts happening again, and once we're out of this, everybody's going to have an opinion. I think that there are, I don't think that every single business should have had a pandemic preparedness kit sort of ready to go. There are potentially an infinite number of disruptors. That being said, every organization should constantly be thinking near and long term simultaneously. And if something works in the near term, you should be asking yourself, am I in control of all of the variables that would enable whatever's working for us today to continue working for us in the future? And I'll give you an example that everybody will understand, and that is the supply chain. So if you're a company and you're sourcing part of whatever it is that you make from just one place, you are probably feeling not so great right now. And over the past maybe 3 decades, efficiency has driven, and I think there was I saw a great post about efficiency on SMR that went through the social media feeds today. But efficiency has become speed and efficiency are prioritized over longer term thinking. And one of the things that I think this pandemic has proven out is the brittleness of today's global supply chain. So, I would not have expected like a global, heavy manufacturing conglomerate, for example, to have predicted COVID-19. That being said, if you're not actively producing scenarios, not because like your C-suite demands it, but because it's a sign of sort of a healthy organization. If you're not producing scenarios that are constantly pressure testing what you do today and whether or not that still works in the future, you have problems. Every organization, everyone that has a strategic plan now has a strategic plan that no longer makes sense. So it does, given what we're in and the crushing amount of uncertainty, now is not the time to throw up in your hands and say, well, we'll just wait. We'll wait for all the disruption to end and then we'll plan things out. Right now, you have to use these 11 macro sources of disruption. You have to look for data. You have to think things through, and you have to start developing hybrid scenarios. So these are scenarios that describe near-term survivability and long-term growth. Most companies don't do that anyways, but now especially is the time to be doing that.
An observation. I think it's really interesting that this huge disruption that we are experiencing right now actually explains or gives very specific context to most of the 11 sources you cite. And I'm going to use that as a lever to start moving us through some of them. But the third thing you list is infrastructure, and boy, are we experiencing how infrastructure can disrupt our world, and the need to understand, right, the broader infrastructures in which we're operating.
Yeah, and so this is one of those categories. Like, I know you say infrastructure and some people gloss over, but here's why it's important. Because I'm not just talking about bridges and roads. So when we are looking at, when we're using this framework, the way that I use infrastructure is much more broad. So yes, obviously I'm thinking about, you would sort of put automation in there, and you would be thinking about global supply chain routes. But it's important to connect, again, like, just as I'm asking you not to look at your industry through a very narrow lens, this framework is magical when you connect different parts of it together. So for example, if we think about infrastructure and geopolitics and the global pandemic, that would lead me to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a sort of huge economic initiative intended to spur growth and activity in emerging markets. But it's not just about building physical infrastructure. I mean, it is for a lot of debt. It's also about laying surveillance infrastructure. And some of it is not necessarily nefarious. If you want to maintain a global supply chain in parts of Africa where nobody's gone with commercial businesses before, you're going to need the internet, right? And you're going to need wireless capabilities. That being said, in what ways has this global pandemic started to shift, either accelerate or decelerate investment throughout Latin America and Africa? Where does that put China? And given where a lot of Western economies have gone over the past 36 months, which is to say more closed off, a little bit more isolationist, does the pandemic start to reshape the global economy, not just because business is bad, but because literally we are drawing new lines between allies, supply chain routes, new types of laws, et cetera. How does that start to look? And then most importantly, where does your company fit in the middle of all of this? So if you're a CPG, if you're a furniture manufacturer, you need to be thinking very, very critically about this and really thinking about the future, connecting geopolitics, infrastructure, the global pandemic back to your company. And again, seeing how those connections play out over time.
Great, thank you. So I want to get to some of the great questions that are coming from our audience, which means we're not going to be able to go one by one through the remaining 7. Folks, I did post the entire list in the chat, and we'll also put a link to Amy's article where she does get into each one of these in more detail. Having said that, there's one of the remaining items on the list does kind of stand out, I think, as less intuitive. Or less even explained or elucidated by the current situation we're in, and that's media and telecommunications. Will you spend a minute on that and the need to monitor that item?
Sure. So I would say that there are 2 factors that anchor every single business, and those are technology and then media and telecommunications. Even the most secretive, close-knit companies still require information channels in some way or another, either to tell others about what you're doing or to learn from others what can be done, right? Or whatever. And it's the case that our media and telecommunications channels are no longer as restrictive as they used to be. They've become democratized, which means that sometimes a silly meme that you may not be participating in, that may not make any sense, TikTok, right? Which I think people kind of sort of understand as a place to share silly videos. what happens in these places has reverberating effects. It starts to shape public consciousness. It sometimes eventually rises to the level of regulation. And so every company really does need to be aware of how information spreads, how to validate that information, and also within this bucket, how information is starting to shift and change. We are on the cusp of something called synthetic media and synthetic content, which would take me longer to explain than the time that we have left. So suffice it to say, this is using generative techniques and existing data to create not just deep fakes that I think everybody's now sort of aware of, but the sort of next generations of that, which include fully generated people, voices. Your previous speaker was talking a little bit about digital twins, simulated environments. There are business value operations. There are ways to grow your organization to do some testing. This is also a security risk because somebody could impersonate, your CSO, your CEO, modulate their voice, and not just for satire, but to embezzle money in ways that you've never thought through before. So every single business has to think through, again, given what we see today, what is the link to media and telecommunications? What is the link to technology? And ultimately, how does all of that, how do all of those factors over which no one entity has all of the control impact my business?
So I want to squeeze in two final questions. So hopefully there's a relatively short answer to the first one. Are all of these sources of potential disruption created equal, or is it important to act like they are? Because a lot of organizations are going to be inclined to obsess about number 7, public health, going forward, and maybe leave some of the other ones less tended to.
Yeah, I would say that there is no one of these that is more important than the others. But as you start to use this framework, I would encourage you to start with one of the areas that feels least connected to your industry. Because again, the point of this is to reveal areas that you weren't paying attention to reveal early risks, to see potential opportunities, to find signals, to use this in conjunction with another framework to spot trends. All of this is to broaden your perspective to see around corners. So start with the one that feels the least connected and know that all of them are, equally important.
Thank you. So I think a lot of people in our audience today may feel as though their organizations are awfully exposed, right? Hearing you describe these many sources, and particularly given the exposure we're all experiencing at the moment. Mm-hmm. Can you leave us with a silver lining?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would consider myself to be a pragmatist, and I believe that we still have agency in building the world as it becomes. So with that being said, we are not helpless in this situation, which feels entirely beyond our grasp. And we should not feel crushed by the amount of uncertainty that we are all dealing with. Everybody is going through crises all day long. So the challenge that I would leave you with is not to just get through it, but to figure out how to thrive, right? In the wake of adversity, where can you project out possible solutions, possible opportunities? We are living through a moment in time that's a little bit like driving a car on slippery ice. If you slam down the brake and just try to stop what's happening or just go back to the way things were, you're going to crash. However, if you lean in to the slip, which feels wrong, and you keep your eye on the road ahead while making tiny little adjustments, you're going to get out of this okay. And that's, to me, hope, right? Because it could be that on the other side of what, this horrific thing that we're all living through, we will have built a better world. And so that's what I would leave you with. And I believe everybody has the power to do that. You just have to make a decision that that's the choice that you want.
Fantastic. Amy Webb, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.